Hello. I wanted to welcome you back to Chapter 3 of Clenard & Meyer's book, Sociology of Deviant Behavior. And by now I suspect you've taken some tests and you probably have figured out that I can't cover everything that's in your reading. I am trying to highlight some of the key ideas, but if you want to do well on the tests, a good suggestion, I hope, would be to have your book with you and to have read it and highlighted the material that is relevant, especially the terms that are in bold, and some of the things that we've talked about in the discussions here. Maybe have a printout of those or be able to access them while you're taking the test. And those things I think will help you to do well if you haven't been doing as well as you would have liked. So now we're moving into new material, the idea of becoming deviant. And the focus here, if I can move this a little bit, is on the major sociological theories of deviance. So sociology is the study of groups, and you can look at things through one of two ways. You can look at structure, and I always think of larger grids, or process, and I think of like sequential order and time and symbols. So the structural theories, as it says here, explore the causes in the structure of entire societies. So larger, like let's say cities, and the way in which those cities allow for some opportunities or not, for example. Process theories are focused on the causes in process by which individuals commit deviant acts. So for example, socialization, learning type theories. Individuals do not become deviant simply by participating in deviant acts. And it says if this were the case, then the world would be full of deviant individuals, and it's simply not true. It's not just the doing of the thing, but it's also partially about the identity that a person has and the way in which it shapes that individual. Here's an example. An individual who walks around campus in the summertime wearing a winter coat, also wearing a head warmer, a scarf, that person may be seen as a deviant because they're violating a social norm. However, the person can barely be identified as a deviant because this is just one action alone. So it could be what they call a one-off, one weird thing that this person does. So they don't seem to embody what we think of as a deviance that carries with them through many situations. A sociological conception of deviance would identify individuals who play a social role that exhibits deviant behavior. So the idea of role arguably involves some level of consistency and expectations related to status and the corresponding behavior. So this chapter focuses on ways that people become deviants, and to understand the processes of acquiring a deviant role, one must examine the social nature of human beings. So the self and the identity of the deviant, as well as the process of socialization into a deviant role. We gain insight into how individuals become deviant by understanding the meaning for those acts. So this chapter is going to have a few different areas within it, emphasizing biological type explanations, psychiatric explanations, which are different from psychoanalytic explanations, and then also to the medical model for understanding deviance. Deviants may be viewed as hypocrites, and a hypocrite is somebody who says one thing and does another. They may be viewed that way because they violate some norms while they actually conform to others. So they're inconsistent. And the example I have here, an individual who's made a career out of counting cards at a casino, which is a form of cheating, may avoid opportunities to cheat on his wife because it's a sacred commitment. So there's an individual who's purposefully engaging in a deviant act, but it isn't a uniform thing. And they may say, well, my morals prevent me from doing something else. So the next bullet point there, no one is deviant all the time. Even the most committed deviant engages in deviant acts only at times. So it's important to keep that in perspective. Individuals do not automatically learn social behavior. You don't come out of the womb knowing how to use chopsticks or a fork. You learn. So these things are acquired through a process developed through socialization. People modify their behavior in response to the demands and expectations or norms of others. So you modify how you act in response to others. Therefore, behavior is a product of social interaction. People perform a variety of social roles, and those represent the behavior that society expects of a person in a given position or with a certain status within a particular group. So a few examples that are written here on the slide. Mother, daughter, father, son, dentist, judge, lawyer. Those are all roles, and they're related to statuses, which are of course related to each other. So mother, daughter, mother, son, those are relationships where there are specific behaviors that are expected. There can be a lot of range and play, but in general there are certain things that should occur. And in the same kind of manner as somebody would learn those roles, people might learn to perform deviant roles. Drug user, burglar, murderer, alcoholic, thief. These are not things that happen immediately. You may conduct a burglary and it may be your first burglary, but a lot of burglars wouldn't consider you a professional thief that way. So you have to learn through active participation and groups that help you understand what that role is. Role playing and role taking not only socializes an individual during childhood, but this process continues throughout life. So deviants learn their roles in the same way that you would learn anything through socialization. Let's try a question. The act of orienting one's own behavior to a set of expectations is called which? And the act is role-playing. You are engaging in that role. You're playing that role. What is this? An act of orienting one's own behavior to a set of expectations defined by a role. You change your behavior, you form your behavior in the expectations that are defined by a role. You also have role sets. So everybody has a complement or collection of role relations that they've acquired by occupying a particular social status. So the example I have here, a doctor has a role set that has specifics concerning relationships between patients, colleagues, and administration. They don't act the same way for each of those audiences. There are differences in how they play that role. You can also look at role prescriptions and role proscriptions. So, as you're being socialized in role taking, a prescription would be a required behavior. So, habits, beliefs, attitudes, motives, and actual conduct required. Proscriptions would be a role that's not permitted to somebody because of other roles that that person occupies. So the example I have here is a bachelor is a proscribed role to a husband. You cannot be a bachelor as well as a husband. We can also talk about deviant role taking and the notion of role strain. Situations with complex role demands where a single person must fulfill multiple roles is the definition of role strain. So as an example, role strain may result from things like unclear role prescriptions, too many roles to fulfill, or conflicting or mutually contradictory roles. So a great example of role strain, I believe, is the transition from being a child to being an adult. And that's because there are, as it says there, unclear role prescriptions. you're moving into adulthood. So you're moving from not being sexual to being sexual, from not being responsible to being responsible. And that is a hard transition, especially for parents, because they're trying to let go and trying to let that child become the adult that they ultimately want them to be, but they don't want them to get hurt or damaged in that process. If you were looking for definitions, there's a section in your text where it goes through all these different terms that we've been talking about on the slides. Another question for you to try. Why look at deviant behaviors in terms of roles? D, all the above, which we'll talk about in the subsequent slide. If you talk about deviant role taking, deviant roles are powerful, or it says they can become powerful. Once a person acquires a deviant role, let's say they're an alcoholic, a drug addict, then other social roles might take a back seat to the deviant role. An alcoholic is defined by wanting and accessing alcohol. When a deviant role becomes that powerful, then it's known as a master role. And that was from the previous question. A master role can become so important that individuals begin to organize other roles around it, and it becomes central to one's identity. In order to understand deviance, it's incumbent upon the researcher to comprehend the world as the deviant does, as that individual who's doing those things understands their activities. And this is a trick because you want to understand as a sociologist, but you also want to be detached so that you can analyze the interrelationships of the deviant world and the larger social order and not make judgments that would affect your understanding in a more objective way. So it says research on deviance has begun with a motivation to correct behavior rather than to understand it. So the first part there is saying that you have to try to understand the deviant as they are. The second part I just read says that the motivation for studying deviance, though, was the idea of changing behavior. So you can see that there's a kind of a conflict there, that what you probably want to do is not impose judgments, but you just want to understand the behavior for what it is. And that's what it says there at the bottom. A balance must be reached to see and maintain the authenticity of what's being observed. It's not a good idea to go into the field and judge people. You should hear them out. That's a basic rule of ethnographic research, which is what many sociologists do who study deviance, ethnographic research. It says sociologists have learned to gather deviant perspectives through in-depth interviews. My area of interest is homelessness, and so I've conducted well over 100 interviews with homeless people to try to understand their lives, their backgrounds, the ways in which they think about homelessness and the way other people treat them, etc. So you can do interviews, you can, it says, solicit insider information from deviants. They can talk to you about the techniques that they use, the way that they interact with other people who also are like them, and participant observations. Another thing that I did when I studied homelessness was to go to homeless camps, soup kitchens, parks, and simply hang out and watch people. And some people would argue that's ethically questionable, but it is a good way to get information on people because they don't necessarily know they're being studied, which can provide you with more valid information, perhaps. Researchers become insiders in order to collect information through participant observation, becoming or posing as members of the study groups. Now, this is one way to do it. You try to get information by joining the group without the group knowing you're doing it. So that would be perhaps very valid information. It might not be the most ethical way to get that information, however. But it says this research usually maintains secrecy. The researcher's targets do not know they are under study. So they're oblivious to the idea that this person's a researcher. The members of the group in this instance, therefore, treat the researcher as one of their own, and they share their lives with this person because they think they're doing it for the sake of pure participation, not for an ulterior motive of doing research on that group. Managing deviance. This is something that you learn about as you do research on deviance, ethnographic work. By the way, ethnography means writing about a people, and ethnography means going into the field and talking to people and trying to get information from the participants. So if you're doing this type of work, you have to think about how people manage deviance. Society's negative sanctions can pose general stigma as a deviant. So stigma is a specific term. It says it's instigated and labeled by social groups who benefit by separating wrongdoers. So the people who stigmatize others are perceiving some benefit from it. Stigma may benefit those of the punishing group, but it does create problems with deviants who must learn to live with that criticism by other people. A question example for you to work through for a second. Deviants use various techniques to manage or cope with the stigma. Which of the following is not a management technique? And these are outlined in your text if you want to take a look. One thing that you'll find they don't do is C. Internalization is not a management technique. It would be creating a sense of shame. So we'll go through these other choices. Under managing deviance, deviants use 5 techniques to manage or cope with stigma. Let's go through them. Secrecy is one where, for example, I think it mentions in the book, a woman who is a stripper will keep that information from, say, her husband or her friends. That means that they're able to avoid stigma because people don't know the deviant act that they're doing. Manipulating the physical setting. An example that they use in the text is people who do work as they're sex workers on the phone. So they have erotic talk with customers. And in those instances, what people might do is, even though they're in an office and they're doing this deviant act, they may have pictures of their family around, pictures that their children have drawn, and that helps them to avoid a feeling of stigma in that context. Rationalizations. An example might be if somebody steals from a store, a large department store, they may say, well, this department store makes a lot of profit. They can endure this loss. The last two, a person who's deviant can manage their stigma by leaving that role, changing to non-deviance. So they quit, if you will. The other side of that is they can join a deviant subculture, and that would mean that they're able to get support. They're able to find others who will help them and accept them without stigma. Sociological theories of deviance focus on social conditions that underlie deviance. Again, sociology is the study of groups. So sociologists are going to look at things differently than what is coming up, which are the individualistic theories of deviance. So sociological theories are going to look at how society defines deviance, how group and subcultural influence relate to deviance, how deviants come to occupy their role, why deviance is distributed in time and space, sometimes and not others, some spaces and not others, and how others react to deviations from norms. The individualistic theories here focus on evaluating conditions or circumstances that affect individuals. So we'll have 4. The biological determinants, so stuff that's inside of you, the psychiatric or medical models, and I want to point out psychiatric differs from psychoanalytic and also psychological principles, and we'll go into those differences. Biological explanations go back to people like Lombroso, Cesar Lombroso, who decided in coming up with the field of criminology that criminals had some kind of anomalies that were, he called them atavisms. They were throwbacks to earlier peoples who were less evolved. And so these, coming from Lombroso, it says there, would trace deviant and antisocial behaviors to physical anomalies. Body chemistry is another possible source of deviance. Hereditary characteristics. And biologists claim that inherited traits can include a whole host of things, from alcoholism to crime to mental disorder to sexual deviations. Biology and alcoholism, you can see a pattern of studies related to this, which we can discuss. Findings from family, adoption, and twin studies, those are all different kinds of studies, suggest that genetic factors may affect behavior of some chronic drinkers, but not others. So there's a limited application of these theories. Researchers have been looking for genetic markers of alcoholism, that is, genes or parts of genes that transmit vulnerability to alcoholism. Is there a genetic component to this? While studies identify a possibility of inherited tendency toward alcoholism, research has failed to identify a specific alcoholism gene that predisposes individuals to heavy drinking. And this is supported by that study from the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism in 1993. So the idea here is that there hasn't really been a payoff in terms of this research in finding a gene, a specific gene related to alcoholism. Question for you. The earliest scientific analyses of crime focused on biological research. Which of the following researchers was known for biological explanations of deviance? Got your guess? Okay. Answer, we've been talking about A, Cesar Lombroso. Biology can influence the origins of crime in many ways, including genetics, inherited traits, that is, hormones that you have, say, for example, testosterone, your body type. There's research by a guy named Shelton who looked at endomorphs, mesomorphs, and ectomorphs. And the mesomorphs were the type that's a stocky body and muscular. And Sheldon found that those were the types that actually tended toward more crime and aggressive behavior. Neurophysiological brain factors, this can involve anything from brain chemistry to some type of insult, like, for example, a tumor. Chemical composition of body tissue, and also other physical dimensions. If you evaluate the biological approaches, you start to see certain things. First of all, under the idea of inheritance, you can't determine deviant behaviors. And the reason is because culture and social norms can't be transmitted through biological genes. Now let's unpack that for a second. Your body, your body chemistry doesn't have a particular gene that says this is a criminal behavior, because criminal law is written by human beings, and it might vary from society to society. So that's what makes this really hard to pin down if you're doing this kind of research. It says social norms and forms of deviance are learned through social interaction and transmitted from families, friends, and common acquaintances. So the biological approach has very limited applicability in terms of studying deviance. The psychiatric model views deviance as having psychological illnesses. So deviant behavior is a product of some fault that lies within the individual. That's similar to a biological approach. Psychiatric explanations, though, emphasize every person at birth has these inherent basic needs, and in particular, emotional security. Emotional security for children is essential for their well-being. If there's deprivation of those needs during early childhood, that'll lead individuals to abnormal personality patterns, according to the psychiatric model. Extreme cases of so-called general personality traits characterize deviance, but not non-deviance. It's double negative. But it means basically that these personality traits, where they're extremes, you have problems like, for example, it says here, emotional insecurity, immaturity, feelings of inadequacy, inability to display affection or aggression, all of which might be connected to deviance. So therefore, deviance is viewed as symptoms of psychological illnesses that distresses individuals unless they're detected and treated. So those distressing feelings, those distressing experiences then are the root of the deviance. Those people who take this view regard most deviance as some form of mental illness or psychological disorder. So a question for you, and you should be able to answer this if you've taken Intro to Psychology. Psychoanalysis was founded by and the answer is D, Sigmund Freud. Psychoanalytic explanations come from the work of Freud. Psychoanalytic scholars explain deviant behaviors through the analysis of the unconscious mind. And this is different from the previous set of explanations because this is about the abstract workings of your mind, not your brain. The unconscious mind is regarded as a world of inner feelings, and this is unlikely to express itself in a direct, obvious way. That's why Freud looked at things like dreams, for example. He looked at things like slips of the tongue as revealing something that the person is not aware of, they're not consciously aware of. Adult behaviors for psychoanalytic researchers are a result of instinctive drives, particularly sexual drives, and early childhood experiences, early childhood reactions to both parents and siblings. So the psychoanalyst defines personality in three components, and this is the work of Freud, who, by the way, was an amazing thinker. He's been criticized pretty heavily, but the innovations that he's credited with coming up with were absolutely singular in the past century, one of the top thinkers in the past century. He came up with this three-part model: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id representing a reservoir of unconscious instinctual animal tendencies or drives. So you're born with those, they come up at birth. Those are like, I need to sleep, I need to eat, I feel aggression, the drives that you have. The ego represents the conscious part of the mind, and that's the part that operates the body. So the ego is partially involved in things like, for example, remembering your phone number, being rational about things, making inferences. The superego mediates a conflict between the id and the ego. The superego is what I think of as the voice of the parent. It defines the social self based on the principles of social norms and culture. So your superego is the voice inside your head that says, oh my God, you're about to do something really stupid. What are you thinking? Psychoanalysts attribute activities of deviance to unconscious attempts to satisfy unresolved infantile desires. So there's this issue from the past that's working its way out through deviant activity. Some believe, for example, that the type of crime a person commits and the type of objects involved in the crime often indicate a certain kind of infantile regression. That's one example of how this might work. Psychological explanations of deviance. Psychologists have identified many personality traits and ascribed behavior patterns to them, including whether or not somebody is, for example, aggressive or submissive, intensely emotional, or, on the other end, inappropriately unresponsive, whether they're suspicious or credulous, self-centered or solicitous for the welfare of others, withdrawing or being eager for contact with others, expecting affection or expecting dislike from others. Psychologists have created and applied dozens of personality tests. They mentioned the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. They mention, I believe, the Rorschach test. They've created these tests and scales and other devices to try to distinguish deviance and non-deviance through this measure. Psychologists often seek to explain nearly all forms of delinquent and criminal behavior as a product of abnormalities in the psychological structure of individual deviants. Psychologists have tried to find personality differences between offenders and non-offenders, but what's important here is that until now, they've remained unsuccessful. Many psychologists refer to deviant personality types as a criminal psychopath or a psychopathic personality, which in and of itself has some problems we'll talk about. Sociologists can therefore criticize psychological explanations of deviant behavior based on the following points. First, human behavior results primarily from variable, socially determined roles rather than static conditions. So the idea is that you need to account for the role and the context rather than these previous things that happened in the past. The context is always where these things play out, and so you can't ignore that. The socially determined roles are the things that create what the expectations are for behavior. It says psychology gives almost no tools for isolating the effects of societal reactions on deviant behavior. And then finally, psychology has produced no evidence of associations between personality traits and deviations from disapproved norms. Just because you have certain personality traits doesn't mean it's going to be causal that you'll deviate from certain disapproved norms. Many people also think about rational choice as an explanation for deviant behavior. So some will explain deviance as purposeful. Rational choice means you made a conscious decision to do something. So the action represents a choice made by the actor to behave in a particular way, to think in a particular way, to live a certain kind of life. And their baseline assumption is individuals have choice in all the behaviors that they do. So you can ask, is this true? Why do drug addicts choose to use drugs? To some extent, they choose, at least initially. Whether or not biology takes over and creates drives, that is a different thing. Why do burglars choose to break into a house? This seems very much a rational choice. Okay, I want to get these objects that I can sell or these valuables, so I'm going to do an intentional act. With rational choice theories, a person makes specific decisions or choices about whether or not to engage in the crime or act, and they're rooted, presumably, in rationality. And that's quite an assumption that people will be rational. We'll talk about in a second. It says an offender does not need to be highly rational or fully informed, but able to make choices involving decisions. So they don't have to be fully rational, but we have some component of rationality. That's one thing that rational choice theorists also can stress. The key is, to understand the context of that decision and the factors that brought users to that decision, that rationality can then be used to explain. If you're evaluating rational choice, you can say that some claim deviants don't choose deviance. They're not making that conscious choice. It says the second indented bullet point, individuals who exhibit aggressive behaviors or thought patterns, like people with mental illnesses, do not choose independently to behave or think as they do. Nobody chooses to have a mental illness And mental illness, you could say, hijacks the brain, and I wouldn't say necessarily makes choices for people, but it colors every thought that a person might have. It does say, though, everyone makes choices. This is true, but some people choose among better and a bigger scale of options. So you can think too about how rational choice is constrained by things like poverty, by things like disease, by things like perhaps addiction. Other people might not have those constraints and therefore are better able to make healthy and better choices.